guy answers. Welcome to the June meeting. Some of you may still think that there's going to be a certain speaker here who's not going to be here tonight. I should explain that Catalin is doing okay. Catalin is an IBM employee in the Sacramento area who is allergic to bees. And she walked out of her house yesterday and got stung and immediately knew she had a problem and was driving pell-mell to the bank, to the hospital. She only got a block and a half before she knew she had to stop. She pulled over, ran up to the house, and collapsed on the porch. So it was really serious, and she was in the hospital from then until about 7 o'clock this morning. But when I talked to her at noon today, she was coming out of it and would be out of it, but probably wasn't in shape to drive from Sacramento down to the Bay Area. So we said we'll have to give her a bye on this this time. It's too bad because it was a very interesting presentation, but this is the most fantastic group you could possibly imagine. What other group would have the creator of 386 BSD contact you when he gets the email saying there's not going to be a speaker this evening and say, oh, I can come. And we're very, very pleased for that. Before getting into it, we're going to videotape tonight's meeting. I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at them, but people are reviewing the videotapes. We keep the archives of all the presentations, and we are now up to 35,000 archive reviews, so there's a considerable amount of going back and reviewing what people said. I don't know, in today's litigious environment, maybe we're going to think about it a little bit, because they go back to, what did I say, in 1999, 2000, 2001. See, I want to be still on record for that. Our speaker tonight, by any means, by any measure, is a real UNIX maven. Bill used to be responsible for BSD on the PDP-11, for those of you that go back to mini computers. And he went from that into doing the 386. And that 386 BSD is the foundation of every Unix system I've ever seen run on an Intel platform. So he's really the father of, in some respects, the lineage of BSD and Linux and all of the other open source packages that are Unix-like running on Intel platforms. He's the founder of 2 different companies. Most impressive was when he graduated from Berkeley, they didn't tell him this was a tough job, but the first thing he did was go out and found a company that actually ran for many years, in the early 80s until the late 80s, called Symmetric. He's been a consultant to more companies than you can count: Sun Microsystems, Honeywell, Bull, Hewlett-Packard, Los Alamos, lots of different things. He's been a true Unix insider for a long time, and as we said in the email going on here, has published 30-some articles in Dr. Dobbs and in Unix Magazine, and he's a recognized authority. He also has a lot of interest in open source, particularly in the current climate of open source, in the SCO climate of open source, let's say, and what's going on with in property rights and what should go on in property rights. And so that's the area in which he would like to spend most of his time this evening. Bill?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Open source is going to revolutionize the next 100 years of technology development. We're sad in the Valley right now because there's a lot of people who can't do as much as they were doing a little while earlier. Rest. Easy. This is just a lull in the action. We're all going to be going back, and it's going to be going at an even more frenetic rate because a lot of things are changing. But the more things change, remember, some parts stay the same. So I want to draw your attention to life in the real world. Real world, by the way, means real issues. Now there's some nice real issues, like one of the authors of 386 BSD got a nice award from Oracle for work on this. Those are really nice real-world issues. You like to be rewarded for the things that you do. But you also got to deal with the obstacles. Now, you guys probably have spent a little time on working with open source. You may have it in part of your data center. You may have it in part of your home. You may have it even on your PDA. Okay? Open source, I wouldn't be surprised if you'll find watches with open source in it in probably a matter of a couple of years. It will be the thing that allows a lot of developers the wiggle room to unify a lot of these disparate technologies that we have. That's the only way that sensible technologists can actually really bring this thing together for the consumer, for the masses, for the businessman. So I'm going to talk to you about the obstacles. I'm going to talk to you also about another issue. And that is, another issue of the real world is, how in the world do we get from A to B? Somebody's got to drive, somebody's got to set an agenda, somebody's got to say we're going to go all over here. That's an issue when you get into open source that you don't have in closed source way. There's some guy who's a big boss, whether he has glasses and several $billion or something else. You have a defined de facto control. Well, that's not the case with open source. That's one of its great advantages, and it's also one of its difficulties. And right now, there are a lot of people who are challenged by the control of open source, and so they sometimes react rather negatively, like you may have seen in the press. Perhaps a little over the top, and you may have noticed that in recent years, we hear about WorldCom and Napster and all sorts of things. It really seems to be a very exciting world in which we live in. You never know when you pick up the newspaper the next day, quite what you're going to see. So control is important. Clarity, however, is also another thing. For a developer, there's nothing more important than clarity. Where do I go next? Why do I go there? Why not this other thing? Do I work on the past, or do I work on the future? And from my perspective, if a developer doesn't have clarity, he doesn't know what to do, and he isn't as effective. Well, open source provides you with avenues to get clarity, but it also can confuse you at times, and you don't need the confusion. So we're going to have to sort that out. And one of the things that has been sadly lacking in recent years has been this idea of history. I think that was one of the things that really dismayed me at one point when we at Berkeley went through the effort of proving where we got our ideas from, where we got our code from, wrote them up in papers. We had the numbers to justify the performance, the comparison with other algorithms. That's about the time that I started to spend more time on business and less time actively pushing bits through a compiler, was that I began to realize that if history wasn't valued, sooner or later there would come this day in which I'd be up here in front of all of you talking about why history matters and where it plays a role in the real world part of open source. Recognize this guy? Okay, I got somebody in the crowd who does. This is Richard Stallman. Now, a lot of these pictures don't have anything to do with the text.
No, circa when? Because I didn't recognize him. I know Richard.
Oh, this is a fairly recent picture. Got it from the
Oh
Boston. Mission. That's really what you see here with him pointing. Okay. Okay. An obstacle for open source is not clearly elucidating the mission and having everybody bought into why are we doing this. Now, maybe you think that the mission is being anti-Microsoft or something like that. I don't know. That's one definition of a mission. Okay? There can be, Richard's mission is that software be free. And he has a very decided view of what that means. He's not even super keen on things like open software because it misses the mission. I remember getting introduced to Richard quite a while ago. He stayed one night at my house in Berkeley, and he had a wonderful view of the possible. And at the time, there was no software in the Free Software Foundation. And you could tell that there was a kind of a pulse, a throbbing. You could see a future coming here. And I learned from him some of his experiences that I'd heard before when I was briefly visiting with the MIT people. My email account originally, by the way, my first email account was at MIT, and it was, my email address was wfj@mitai-ai, before they had the domain names. And if you want to, you can go and search the archives and see some of perhaps not the most brilliant comments in the world about it. But it was kind of an exciting time to be there. And I did recall the problems between LMI and symbolics, and that's where I think I would date a lot of this is coming from. So mission, clear mission, if you don't have that in place, you've got an obstacle. And I think one of the issues, by the way, that we're going to see faced relatively soon is that open source development and free software are going to have to be more clear about what their mission is. So we don't have what the military calls mission creep and what NASA calls unplanned contingencies. And we're going to have an unplanned contingency right now. I don't think anybody's really enjoying it very much. But that's why you have a clear mission. All these areas we're going to go through, and I'm going to be able to connect you with the past, the present, and the future here. Politics, okay? If you have a clear mission, if your politics are built around the mission, that's great. You're energized, but you know, you got to make sure everybody in your group agrees, because if somebody doesn't agree, then they form another splinter, and that splinter then can make life difficult for the goals of the original mission. So I'm not saying that these things are bad. I'm just saying be aware. These are where all of the problems that are going on right now, they're rooted here. Liabilities. Any business, including a business that works off of development of a open project, whether it's a free software project or simply a group of developers that are sharing their source and hope to do something else with it. It doesn't matter if it's free. You always will have these. You can't get away from them. There's a lot of wonderful video software out there that a lot of people are using to put bits on VCDs. And there are about 45 different patents that cover these areas, a lot of them held by Dolby, in particular for various kinds of audio compression and encoding schemes. I don't think anybody's terrifically worried that Dolby is going to start enforcing those rights with the various versions that are out there. But they can do exactly what is going on right now in the operating system camp. They can do so in a video room. There are literally hundreds of ways in which these things can bite. So we got to understand that this stuff's real. It's not going to go away unless we start rewriting the intellectual property laws. And I don't know about you, but I've been around here for a number of years. I haven't seen them change really vastly. In fact, if you were to take a look at where the intellectual property rights are heading right now, they're not looking like they're going to be getting any weaker. They look like they might tend towards a stronger. So these obstacles, whenever you do development, you have to be aware that they might bite you. when we were doing BSD, we were mostly concerned with copyright and trade secret issues. And I will go into them a little later in this presentation. But the biggest thing that was really, really concerning us was that we had so many developers that were contributing. And that's really the power of the open model. The open model, by the way, is going to completely erase the closed model eventually. Even I think Microsoft will become a part of that, simply because of the laws of economics. With so many people putting so much effort into the same things, scalability-wise, how can you get around something like that? Even if Microsoft were to invent a closed source AI model where they didn't even need people, they would still not be able to scale, even if they covered all of Redmond with computers hip deep, because you still need to have people make the decisions. The developer is the person who makes the difference here. And the developers, I think, got in the shaft over the past 20 years. And I'm really very upset about that, because the developer is the one where the future comes from in the first place. We need more developers, not less developers. We don't need to be shipping it out of the country. We need to be making a world of software development. The PC is just the beginning, not the end. And so I think this is going to be a real challenge for us as a whole. If you're going to be doing open development, how are you going to finance it? There's got to be sustaining revenues. There's got to be something that works. Now, a lot of times, they're hidden inside of other people's economies. Like right now, believe it or not, when a developer goes and develops a common piece of code, he doesn't know this, but every single person who uses that code, he is in effect eliminating a certain number of cost items from that person's area. You just eliminating it. So you probably don't know it, but he's lifted like a heavyweight lifter. Thousands and thousands, in some cases millions of people. Maybe just a little. But if someone else then does development on another piece, then that one's raised equally.
That's particularly true of middleware type of applications, right? Because they get used everywhere.
Yeah, but it's also true of utilities. It's true of file formats. Okay. If some leverage one piece, the rest breaks free after a while. So there's fantastic effects that it has in our economy. Much like it was talked about the internet revolution, the open source revolution really hasn't happened yet. Yes?
So I'm interested in a couple of things there. When you speak of mission, if I think back to the theory, which I've had a reasonable amount to do with, I can't recall there have been any mission apart from building a packet capture and analysis tool. And there's been no financial support to people, to anybody really on the team. We've all just been a group of people who have decided that we wanted to contribute code. But I agree that of course, that's been enormously enabling, because I see dozens of companies here in the Valley who use, the results of my coding.
Well, that is your financial contribution, because they did not have to go out and spec a piece of software, bring it in, pay somebody to learn about it, which is a period of time, and hope to get a result from it. A lot of times, one of the things that's really great about free software and open development software is that, and I do draw the distinction generally for this gentleman here because I respect him and I don't wish to diss anybody along the way by accident. The point here is there is money. You just have to identify where it is, okay, and realize where it's going and what it's doing at any given point in time. Everything is political, everything is interacting, but you can't do ignore the effects of these liabilities or of the finances. You can't ignore the politics. When you ever create a piece of software, you're responsible for it. People may like you, they may not like you, it may be fair, it may be unfair. It doesn't matter, it exists. It's part of this sheet of things that we have to figure out. How do we make this work as a group? And there's a responsible aspect of it, and there's a stand by your guns aspect of it as well. And that's what I see a lot right now is people aren't organizing the information very well. They're being driven more by the panics of the moment and not thinking about what does this really mean? Where is it really going to go? Control. We've got two models and that I see quite often. There's a loosely coupled model, and that's been dominant since Berkeley faded into the back. The tightly coupled model involves a series of groups and agendas. One of the things that has been compared is effectively the BSD control everything and then get out a release every a year or so or more, and the incremental release as you go model. Some people are more comfortable with one, others are another. This turns out to be a big issue when you look at it in terms of process for maintaining the integrity of an organization. If you can make both work, I don't see any issue for it, but you can't be loosely coupled without having some way of maintaining the integrity of the source space at any given point in time. When we get too loose, we create opportunities for things to go wrong, and that's something that one doesn't want to see. On the other hand, if it gets too tightly coupled, then there becomes lots of competing agendas here, and it's very hard for the average user to sort them out. So the user ends up going, I'm so confused. All I want is something to work for me. That's an error. I had a crash on my disk on the way over. It was lots of fun. And I guess we lost this too. Sorry about this. Okay. My experience with this comes out of the University of California, Berkeley, where I was a student in the 70s, and I spent quite a bit of time after being a student there, being involved with various efforts. There are a lot of big names. There are a lot of names that have contributed to this stuff. If I was to go and list everybody involved here, I would definitely be having hundreds of thousands of names. And I would still not be probably getting every last one of them at any given point in time. One of the things that a lot of people seem to be missing right now is that Berkeley's first operating system group was actually in the 60s, not in the 70s. It did Berkeley time-sharing system. And I have some of the code for it if you're interested in taking a look at it. It ran on an SDS 940 computer. It was one of the first demand-paged operating systems of the time. It was a transistor computer with lots and lots of core memory. The last one I saw that was operating was over in the chemistry department because they had some codes on it that they couldn't replicate anywhere else. And Butler Lampson and a number of other people were responsible for it. Ken Thompson, by the way, was at the design review meetings for the Berkeley time-sharing system. And there are things like fork and there are things like exec in the Berkeley time-sharing system. And it was really interesting because I mentioned this once during the USL lawsuit that was going on between Berkeley and various and sundry groups, and the attorney woke up and left the room, and I found that very interesting. Suddenly, there was a change in the air, I understand, from the way things were going there. See, a lot of times people forget history. They forget where this stuff comes from. The fact that there's been a considerable amount of integrated work by researchers over several years. Dennis Ritchie once commented to me that he thought that UNIX was nothing as much as a modern implementation, this is back in the PDP-11 days, of the compatible time-sharing system done at MIT many years ago, CTSS, that ran on IBM 7094. Now, he's not really saying that there's a one-for-one correspondence there, because the machines were very different, the way they handled interrupts, the way it would process memory and work disk drives and things like that. It's a radically different machine than, say, a PDP-11. Although I've often heard a Cray supercomputer, the Cray 2, Cray 1s, having characteristics that were very similar to a PDP-11 because of their segmentation registers and the way in which you would tend to optimize and program them. So weird parallelisms are present with a lot of this stuff. I find that some of the algorithms that I did on the PDP-11, like the segmentation and overlays that was done then, can be used to extend the interface of a 32-bit microprocessor just as effectively as it did a 16-bit processor. So if you think about it, algorithms come out in and out of vogue all of the time. And good scientists and good businessmen track where things come from at any given point in time. That's where rights and prior art come in all of the time. And that turned out to be important later on. Now, this history extends all the way forward into the present. And I got back involved about here because I was worried that this wouldn't continue. That all the wonderful work that was being done at Berkeley, and had been done over the years, might end up on a VAX. There were carton VAXs out the door at the time for the gold in the contacts. They would go and take the machines out, strip the contacts of the board, and gain like $5 or $10 worth of gold out of a $40,000 board all of the time. And the other machine was a CCI Power 632, which was a byte-swapped VAX. It wasn't going to live very much longer beyond that either. That was the original reason for doing it. It changed as time went on. That was the mission. Move BSD to a 386. It's documented on the web as 386 BSD, a modest proposal, which was circulated at the time. It used a community development model not unlike the Sun Java model, although not nearly as particular about certain things. This work was done largely at and in Berkeley's offices. And the community model allowed a large, I see I've got another thing, a large number of people access to a limited subset of source. At that time, Berkeley hadn't made the commitment to go and provide a open development version of its software. But it was this was the genesis of that project. It was documented in DDJ, and it was an active account as it occurred. So if you go back and look at those articles, you've got to realize that as one article went out, we were doing these things in time. Now, this turned out to be very helpful for backtracking later on by the legal eagles, because they could see the emails. Okay, there was a record of the emails. They could see everything that was going on with this project. They could see the origins of it. They could see the footnotes. They could even see how things changed in a galley prior to publication. And so if one was going to be doing anything other than a straightforward job, you couldn't do it and keep up with the rate of release and publishing. And this reminded me very much of what was talked about by a professor who told me that if I was going to be an academic, I'd have to learn to publish, or I wouldn't be able to keep in the field, keep doing things. People wouldn't take me as credible. So by publishing, that turned out to be one of the strongest ways of communicating the intent of what we were doing and the point of what this was about. There was no hiding. There's no way of playing a game in there. We were quite literally writing the articles. In one case, I wrote an article 5 minutes before deadline at the office and took it with a floppy disk and put it into their production machine. And then they finished that part of the article. It even has spelling errors in it, by the way, because I didn't get a chance to spell check it. That's how timely it was. And you know what was also interesting about this is that people were getting back to us and saying, you made a mistake in this line of code. And they were doing that in real time, you know, like a month delayed. It would show up in the letters or in an email. And that meant that the whole process of how this was doing was in effect being vetted continuously. People were proposing better algorithms all of the time, and some of them actually got adopted in subsequent articles. The earlier, this is the code review process to try to make sure that we were doing an honest, good job of our development code. We looked at all of the contributions that we got in, and we did the first scan that you do. Everybody does. You look at the comments, the file names, the code structure. Is this a genuine article? Generally, you can tell if somebody's done a good job and had a background in this area, they make a good program. You know, programmers, developers can see good code. They can also see the fingerprints in the code to know what it is that they're getting. They don't want anybody else's stuff. They want the real, genuine article. The second tier of this is that of algorithms. Algorithms, as you know, can be classified very nicely. And you do this anyways when you look at the performance of an algorithm. You want to see if it's order of n squared, if it's linear, if it's a power function or exponential. And especially when you're in an operating system, every little bit of that machine matters to you. One of the things that was constantly changing was the memory allocation policies. The memory allocation policies, frequently we would find that the system would be starving for memory because it had fragmented memory in a peculiar way. And the early versions of 386 BSD are, you can tell it got worse, it got better, it got worse, it got better, and it was all around how to make sure that you were coalescing memory appropriately and not inducing new errors. And that was an example of an algorithm that went through a lot of change. So by classifying things, you could tell where things would come from and who was responsible for them. Because there'd be certain people who follow the Knuth model for certain algorithms, or would innovate new ones, or there'd be the latest algorithm that would be in a book like Patricia Trees or something at the time. And this was how you knew a lot of what was being contributed to you. You could also tell when somebody was being lazy and not doing as good a job as they could. And sometimes you have to send back to them something that's, they wouldn't really read this with great joy, but can't you use this algorithm and not that algorithm on it? Because we know this one works better for these reasons. If you want to go run the numbers yourself and do a paper, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. That's the match with known targets. The third tier is heritage. Heritage is we're about to go and put this stuff in. We're about to commit here, and we're not going back on this. So we need to know what the heritage is of this code and this developer. What else has he done? Has he done other things like this before? What was the experience with those pieces of code? Were they used in somebody else's product? Were they, is this a spin-off of some other group or some other venture? There's some code in 386BSD, in fact all of the BSDs, which came originally from a dead company. I had to go back and check to see that the company truly was dead and where the rights were transferred to. I spent 20 hours once with a lawyer dealing with that very issue and documenting it to everybody's satisfaction. Not an easy thing to do. The other issues were progression. People go and they design something. You can tell they go from one algorithm to the next algorithm to the next. They actually run the regression tests, and from that you know that this person is doing their job and is a true soul to what it is that they've committed to. Those are the things you start looking for. Now you're about ready to go and make and accept something here. Now you've got to your last hurdle that we had to do. And that was dependency on hidden aspects. What if this guy doesn't know that there is something that he's using that is embedded there? Okay. There are some silly patents out there that you want to know about. A lot of times people aren't aware of them, but that comes from looking at similar protected objects and understanding where things manage to lie. Now, prior to Net2's release, which is what 386BSD was based on, it's not based on 4.4 BSD like the other ones. It's based actually on Net2. And Net2 was litigated over, but 386BSD was never. And the reason why? A very simple reason. When we released 386BSD, we didn't release everything that was on the Net2 tag. Because there was a big disagreement here. There was a lot of work at Berkeley on matching against protected code database. This does not get talked about very much. I think this probably is the first time this has ever been mentioned. There was databases at Berkeley on source, so complete copies of source, and a way of using it as a database. And so that was a way of making sure that nothing unfortunate escaped. That was the idea behind it. Yes? No, I'm sorry, I thought this was your hand. Sorry. It also, by the way, didn't only have Unix, even very old versions of Unix. One of the interesting things, by the way, is that we found that pieces of old Unix were showing up in new Unix from time to time. And we could never figure out where that was happening. But during the process of putting together the Berkeley release, there were a number of issues like this that came up on a continuing basis. And you would have them reintroduced. So you'd have to rerun these database scans from time to time. And some of this also, you'd see pieces of other people's systems show up in that had nothing to do with Unix whatsoever. So you'd have to scan against them as well. Very few people would have such a database. You'd have to have licenses to have such a database. They had the licenses. That was one of the things about being in an institution. It could check for things and could make an assertive claim that one tried to track down even the unfortunate ways in which things could be accidentally pulled back in. And that's one of the things that Berkeley did. It was really good, really first rate, I thought. But one of the things that I found took issue with was preserving some of what I would call the obsolete design components. And those were kept, things like CList, BMAP, CDAV switch, for example. These are things that were kept largely for 30-year-old disk drives, disk drive drivers and tape drivers and things like that that nobody wanted to bother to rewrite. And I couldn't really understand why anybody would want those things, because you couldn't have them on a 386 in the first place. You couldn't have them in any modern machine looking forward. So it might be useful to somebody, I suppose, who's trying to make a living supporting an obsolete machine, but that doesn't sound to me like a very logical thing to have at any given point in time. That turned out to be an issue later on. Those things weren't actually the long-term 386 BSD goals. Interestingly enough, all of these items on this list, when Berkeley and AT&T were working together earlier, were meant for architectural extinction 5 or 6 years before. And nobody wanted to bother to do the work to actually do that. That's where I think most of the issues really revolved around, in my opinion, for the exciting times that Berkeley, USL, and a couple of little companies had at any given point in time. And really what you get down to here is, where does this boundary end? Maybe that continues to this day. Maybe one can consider that these are UNIX inventions. So wouldn't it be funny if it turns out that all people are arguing about are things that are so obsolete as to be almost laughable to a hardened developer who goes, I can do that better. I've got a much better idea on how to manage memory, how to interface to the outside world. Well, this is what drove me when I was looking at this, is focusing on letting Unix and other systems have their own innovations, but then out-innovating them. And one of the things I really admire about certain other groups is the fact that they don't stay stuck in the past. They actually leave in the dust their own creations. They out-develop. They out-think what they are working on at every given point in time. They stretch beyond. And they do it in a very credible and straightforward way. That's one of the best ways of ensuring you have a genuine first-rate system at any given point in time. And that's how you make your own innovations. With 386 BSD, after leaving Berkeley, we were faced with a dilemma here. When we were originally with Berkeley, Berkeley was going to release this code in a usable fashion. 3 times they were supposed to release it and didn't. And at the end of Net 2, they did not release a working version to everybody in the articles that we were writing to. We wrote to readers, and we said, you're going to get this, because we were told they were going to get this. So now, here we get this big surprise at the end of this, that they're not going to get this. And we didn't care for that too much, so we completed this and delivered it to the reader. Because then we made good on our promise. Past that, it was whether or not it would live on its own, given that people were going to want to take it someplace. Had no further ambition past that very much. Maybe writing about it because it was a very interesting project. So all we did was set our sights on basic functionalities without new issues. We didn't want to grow the base. Berkeley was going to have to be responsible for what they committed to and what we helped them do. But we did innovate stopgap mechanisms. Those mechanisms were important. That meant that the code got out to people. We didn't use any of the Unixisms that we could correctly identify and could track down as being something that somebody cared about. And we took it further in terms of regulatory issues because we didn't want to have someone see that what we were doing was anything other than going and committing to our promise that we stated originally when we started the work up. that we were going to get Berkeley Unix onto the 386, and it was going to be available to people. We did it. It was very simple. It took a lot of work, and we kept the regulatory issues involving issues of export controls out of it entirely. And that was our way in going through this, of making sure that the reader, the user, had a chance to execute this code. Now, it may be that it wasn't usable to them, or they would take it farther or not take it farther. That's irrelevant. They got a chance to try it. And I know there's a lot of people who sent me an email going, I had to try a single floppy Unix system, just at least once, to see that you could actually bring off such a thing. And that was kind of a fun thing. There was 250,000 downloads. I think it was the first week. And that was pretty impressive. It tended to melt down routers at the time.
There were mirror sites. They had to set up major mirror sites all
That
over
was
the place.
the beginning of the mirror site.
Yes.
With release 1.0, we went and we took it further by implementing Berkeley's architectural review suggestions. And that actually allowed us to implement what was called an active kernel object model. What that meant was that it was possible to move away from static configuration issues that were in Unix early on in all Unix-like systems, because they relied on a very simplified view of the universe that could fit into a PDP-11-sized computer. And now that we're able to use a larger scale architecture, it seemed a sensible thing to do. And we aimed it towards still further innovation, the dynamic kernel, which I'll get into. This is what happened. This is largely, it has continued on after losing the track of history. There are other people, other operating systems are far more interesting in terms of their development model. But it's still running today. This is as of June 10th on this GIF here. But it's in active use as a project to be able to demonstrate this state-of-the-art functionality, which is what we were aiming to do. We think that this constitutes a unique intellectual property in and of itself right here, and that no operating system has yet gone quite into these directions. The closest we know of anyone working in these directions is that Microsoft's research projects are aimed vaguely in this area, at least the last time I talked to Rick Rashid a few months back. And my concern at the time was, why isn't open source constantly innovating as faster than closed source? It's got all of the capabilities, it's got wonderful developers, rich intellect, and the mission to do so. That's how it stays away from situations that can bedevil it at times. You have to have a future that is enough separated from the past so that people don't get focused on the past, on the present. A good lawyer stays focused on the present and doesn't think about the future quite so much. And they try to see where the past and the present fit together. And that's where their mindset is. That's how they can deliver good work product in their profession. But a good developer and an excellent designer, they have to always be focused a little farther down the stream. Now, in closing, what's not important? These are non-issues. Licensing, I don't think, is as important an issue. You may like one, you may like others. I think they're great for their respective uses. I think they do a wonderful job. And I think it doesn't really make as much difference to the supportability of open development or in Richard's terms, free software products. Rights enforcement, that's the rights holder. That's not the issue for the developer. What it is you don't want to be in the rights holder's trajectory at any given point in time. That's how you stay out of that particular argument. But you have to respect the rights holder is going to be awfully concerned about their rights at times. Maybe rightly, maybe wrongly. It doesn't matter which, but that's not the issue to be discussed here. That's their issue. You will find that there's litigation galore for lots of specious reasons. And that's also a non-issue, because that happens irrespective of good process, bad process. All it is bad litigation can go a lot farther when you don't have a disciplined way of reacting to it. The open source business model is also not important in this consideration. It's very important if you're trying to please, say, a venture capitalist who sees something at the end of a rainbow here and has to see that. But that's not the issue for a sustainable open source model. You don't have to have obvious money involved in this. There will always be money involved with everything you do with software because it is an intellectual property. It will always be an intellectual property. We have to recognize that. But these aren't important. Here's what's important. Leadership. When you have a leader in a community, must realize that leader is not a punching bag for ideas. A leader is somebody who can explain to you why you go in a particular direction. And one of the things I encourage you to do is whoever you decide is the leader of these things is to support their efforts to be able to maintain a competent leadership. Because they don't need dissension of ideas and random thought. What they need is they need a courageous group of people who think clearly about why it is that they're involved in staying in the mission that I talked about earlier. Okay? You guys decide who the leaders are going to be. That's one of the wonderful things about open source. But once you commit, you stay committed, I think, to leadership. And realize that that doesn't mean second guessing. That means there is something about why that leader is there in the first place. But you also have to expect something in return. That's accountability. We're all going to have to be accountable. We're all going to make mistakes. I've made my fair share of it. And we're also going to have to plan a graceful recovery. Because if we don't, we're just going to complicate matters later on. And the best way of doing it is having a good process, and I'll get to that in a moment. And so when you get down here, if you have an obvious intent as to what you're doing here, it's pretty clear. You can either pay attorneys or you can pay developers. I'd rather pay developers. I love attorneys in their own special way. But I know that developers will make a product and make a good one. And those are the guys who I've been fighting for all of my life. How do we get into the current situation you see in your newspaper? This is my opinion. Not everybody shares this. But having been the version, let's say, and watched it from the sidelines, this is what I think was the issues. You really have to take, even if you're not doing a business, you're still doing a business. You have to be serious about the IPR issues. It's not going to go away. Believing that because something is considered free software and it's not going to be a target because nobody's putting any obvious money in it or getting a paycheck from it is a little naive. Just let me flat out say that. It's still intellectual property. There's still money flowing through the system over it. So you always have to believe in qualified review. And what qualified review is, it's not like I hand it off to my son, who is a early BSD admin right now. He's going into the 8th grade. And he has a little problem with partitioning from time to time. He seems to believe that the C partition doubles the size of his apparent disk space. But the thing is he's not qualified to review a piece of code yet. A qualified person to review it is somebody who's worked in this industry for a while and is covered quite thoroughly by seeing how this plays out in industry. We're professionals. An issue list and a way of mitigating things is also important. At Berkeley, we mitigated hundreds of issues long before they ever saw release. And I don't really have a strong sense of that. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I haven't seen it. And I would welcome seeing more of that because that would make me feel comfortable. There's also got to be an independent authority ensuring process is being followed. BSD had Berkeley, and Berkeley had significant pieces of review. It could have done better. I think it should have done better, but you have to have something there. 386 BSD had DDJ and its publishers, and before we could release anything, we met with a lot of people. We had to jump through several hoops. We never told anybody about these because it didn't seem to be important at the time. We thought that they expected this of us anyway, so it was not to be a matter to really spend a lot of time on. But that's something, somebody has to step up to the bat and say, these guys did their job. And that's where a lot of the veracity in maintaining that something has done its job comes from. Now the third thing I think meant how we got into this is none of this would have happened if we hadn't had a Napster and a Napster decision. Because there were a lot of judges who thought very kindly of people who were working on technology. And they tended to decide in their favor in general. And now we're going through a period where it's the opposite. And I don't like that at all because I don't think it helps us. It doesn't help anybody involved with the stuff, who uses it, who develops with it, who tries to see a new and more powerful future out of it. And that's a shame, because a few are the ones responsible for a larger issue. The other thing is there was a spirit of anti-professionalism. And it's fun to be a rebel, and that's okay. It's, you can wear your hair differently, you can do a lot of things differently. But professionalism is an interesting thing. It's something that really comes in valuably when you go and try to convince somebody that you've done a good job with something. And I always thought that professionalism was going to make a big difference here. And I'd like to see it return. I think that it's going to be part of seeing that we get through this period well. The small-time hood attitude also, I've seen it lately in some things in the newspaper. I don't think that helps this. We've got to realize this is still a software industry. It's not going to vanish overnight. So, when is it all going to end? This is just another bubble burst. Perhaps you've seen a few of them. Perhaps you've suffered through a few of them. I think it's going to end when we get back to dedicated, disciplined professionalism. I saw around places like Sun an attitude towards something called over-the-fence code tossers. That's the way they were described. And I thought that that was a ridiculous joke, because anybody who believes that they can have something vanish in the course of time is simply fooling themselves. Bits can live forever. They can be eternal. That's actually something that's afflicting the media industry right now. They're just as worried as one copy getting out the door as a million copies getting out the door, because the one copy can be turned into the million copies in an eye blink. The internet can replicate so fast. You could probably design the world's fastest Xeroxing machine that could do probably complete copies of everything in a few microseconds with enough parallelism and enough scripts thrown here and there. So you got to respect this situation and clearly document your true work from the start so that it never, ever becomes an issue. And rapid responsive issue mitigation is what's going to drive us out of this as well. And with this, we'll build up a history of trust and reputation again. And with that, we'll be back at the beginning of the circle. And this does not defeat the open software model. It actually enhances the open software model. The open software model, I am fully committed to. I believe that it's going to be the case that we're going to see in our lifetime major changes as a result of it. But it's only going to happen in the context of something that's supportable, something that's defensible. Who wants to go and have one of these little episodes every few years? I don't think you guys want to see anything like that. Well, this is the way I think out of it. So what are we in store for? Here's what I unfortunately predict. I expect we haven't seen the big guns yet. The big guns probably later this summer. And I think we're going to see a lot of overreaching claims. And I think that's going to scare a lot of people out of open software development, and it shouldn't. And I encourage you, if you feel scared about this, to talk to people about it and to find ways of mitigating that effect, because it's the time actually to do very powerful development, very innovative work. No better time, because now is when it will be seen the most. I also expect that we're going to have an indeterminacy. Now with the lawsuit between Berkeley and USL, that continued for 2 years. I think this one will be longer, from what I'm able to guess. And I think that the indeterminacy will likely affect things. I know that people switched from 386 BSD to Linux because they were worried about 386 BSD being hit. It never got hit, but it didn't matter because people were going, it's going to hit, it's going to come down,
right.
and bad things are going to happen, and cats and dogs will be living together. So we're going to get some of that. And if you're a staunch Linux user, stay a staunch Linux user. Don't let any of this folderol confuse you. What you're working on is very important, and stay focused on what you're working on. And let the lawyers and the judges sort it out. They know best, eventually, these matters. And all we can do is hope that reason will prevail in the long run, and I think it will. But don't jump around, because it doesn't help you. We'll also see uneven treatment. We'll see selective targeting of some people, and that'll be very unfortunate. But that's what happens during these unfair times, and I want you to be aware of it. And yes, it's going to make a lot of people nervous, but it will happen. And I think that what the best policy is for something like that is to feed back through the public channels that that's not at all a fair or an appropriate thing to do. Companies eventually do respond to that in a proper manner, because they have to keep the goodwill of their customers. It may take a while, but that's the best policy on that I can recommend.
So, do you think that Microsoft, to name one company, might indulge in that sort of thing? And I'm asking from a sense of my own well-being, because I work on Samba quite a bit, and there's been discussion around whether or not they might target us.
Well, speaking specifically to that issue, the way in which companies go about this process is they're primarily motivated in a tight time towards finding a piece of revenue. And that's been long the reason why a lot of open source developers haven't perhaps thought as much about the issues I've been bringing up tonight. Because they went, well, you know, nobody's using this that can be targeted. What would they get out of such a thing? Here's the question you should ask to decide whether or not you're in somebody's vital way. By pushing you out of the way, can they gain a valuable foothold? Then they might do it. In the case that we're seeing right now, the valuable foothold is to be able to own the rights to a joint development project. That's the way I view it, anyways. And you can see how that can become extremely valuable. Now, in the case of a Samba, that means more file and print servers sold to companies. Probably Samba's contribution to file and print servers, probably a few percent in Fortune 500 companies. So a product manager isn't going to see that as considerable target. Now, there are companies that just decide that they want to lock everything up. Like there are media companies, and they spend a lot of time locking up the assets of long-dead television programs. They run around the web and threaten to sue people over little websites, fan websites, with tiny little bits of content on them. And I think it's probably one of the stupidest things I've ever heard of in my life, that they believe that's part of how they police their assets. And I think that that's perhaps an overreaction. So people can still overreact, but generally I would imagine it's coldly, shrewdly thought through by a product manager going, I could get this, and I'm never going to get that revenue anywhere else. So my guess is probably no in your particular case. But I think that you've got to realize that if you have any involvement with something that isn't as good as it should be, maybe there's a way of doing better, and maybe there's a way of doing more. You should never have to ask that question in the first place. You should be able to go, I have free rights to use these interfaces, and that's not something that's covered by an intellectual property right. And the mechanisms by which I do that are all documented in these ways in terms of prior art in these areas. So I feel satisfied that my level of scrutiny for what I am doing is quite adequate, and I've made a conscious decision to find those things out. And thus, if I was to be involved in such a process, I could say, this was my process, this is how I did my process, these are the results of my process. I may have found these issues, I remedied them in these ways, and that is considered very strongly as a very positive defense. It makes it very difficult for people to prove you had an ulterior motive to effectively, if you'll pardon me, screw them. And I think that that's, as open source developers, you always have to do that. I was always conscious of it with 386BSD because I wanted to respect the other people there. That was my prime reason for doing it. Because I wanted to be able to with my customer, which was the reader, I wanted to do what they asked of me. Once done, that was up to them whether they took it further. They'll always vote that way, just like they'll vote on anything long term. Nothing lives forever. Now, the new development base is something I wanted to point out to as well. I think we're going to see suddenly people developing new pieces of software. And at some of the large companies I've been a consultant for, the concept of clean room development is a cheap fix for anything, because you basically go, well, let's stop arguing about it, because here's a piece de novo, and I can prove that now I've done all the rules I talked to you earlier about, has been done to this piece of code, and I can show that the people involved with it never saw this stuff ever in their life. And that is another element that I think we're in store for. We're going to see some fast movement on those grounds. That doesn't alleviate the problem, that mitigates some of the problem. And so keep it in perspective as this goes further. I thank you for being a very kind audience, and I'd love to take lots and lots of questions from you.
Well, it seems like every other week. Oh, Too fast. It seems like every other week I come up with a brilliant idea for some new project. And sometimes I implement half of that project, sometimes I don't. Usually I intend to release it as an open source project. Very few of them actually come to that point. But one thing that is always potentially possible is that some company like Dolby or, although I don't work in that particular field, but some company has patented some process or algorithm or something that I totally unwittingly infringe upon. And although of course, I think most open software people will agree that that's evil for them to do so, they can come after me. And I'm just a guy with very little assets, and I can't afford to hire a lawyer to defend myself, or even apply a pro bono or something. But the thing is, what advice would you give for me to avoid that? Do I need to go through large levels of research? I mean, do you, if you start a new project?
Well, look at it this way.
How much do I need to be worried about that?
First off, I'm not qualified to give any legal advice.
Of course not.
But that's the standard disclaimer. The point, though, you should think about is if you were doing this at a company, you might want to file patents. You're not file patents. But what part of your job responsibility is to know the state of the art of the field. And the extent of reasonable activity here you would expect for someone to do is to become acquainted so they were competent. And that's a very good job for any developer to do. For example, when you go to change the kernel scheduling algorithm of an operating system, there are hundreds of times people have played with scheduling algorithms. You can go and find 20 or 30 different kinds of references to this if you just walk over to any library. And you'll find that they have, there's been a lot of work done on what are good ones, what are bad ones, and what are the comparative elements of them. You can also, by the way, go and with the patent search on the web, very cost effectively, find out where some of these bears may lay. And it's not a lot of work, it's typically a few days worth of work. In my work as an engineer, and I have done this many times before I start work on a new piece of, on a new piece of technology, I would spend more time understanding what other people did with it first. So I didn't repeat their mistakes or not understand how this moment in time is different than their moment in time. For example, the relative speeds of the bus on a processor and the internals of a processor, that's something that's changing at a radical rate. So the innards are fantastically fast. The edge of the die is as slow as it's always been. And that's going to continue for a while. So that means that the algorithms that you use inside of the chip now have to optimize the number of fetches coming off of it. The guy who solved that problem 10 years ago didn't face that as an issue. He could fetch all the live long day because the processor on the inside could never really catch up. And so a lot of times you get your best ideas from understanding the state of the art. And one of the things that turns out to be very crucial for being able to explain yourself as a good engineer, whether it be in a legal setting or in a professional setting, is being able to answer those questions as to why this is a better algorithm for these reasons. And if you get to the point of being able to do that, you're doing the best job you can as an engineer in the first place. So it didn't cost you anything because now, because you have the highly developed skills of being a good engineer and people value what you've done, okay, you're already the subject matter expert on this area that will be trusted. And any superfluous claim that comes along as a result of your efforts, it will be very difficult for them to establish the same kind of scrutiny as you've done. So just by being a good engineer, that's your best defense is what I'm trying to get at there. It just means that if you do open source, being sloppy about it is not a particularly helpful thing. Think of open source as having no difference than going out and selling a product as well. You still have to provide the same level of scrutiny. But if you're interested in the topic to begin with because you want to do the best job possible, it doesn't matter because you wouldn't release something that was less than that to begin with. And so what I find is that the best people in this area never have a problem. And so why not just be the best?
I like your reaction to this. There's some very interesting patents out there. I think some patents are granted, my feeling, some patents are granted by people who really have no comprehension of what they are really doing. There's a company down in Redondo Beach that has a patent that says, I have an image or something and I modify it so that the number of bits is reduced, and then I reverse that process on the other end to get the regular image back again, or something very close. And they have a patent on that. Now, anyone who compresses an image for transmission anywhere is owing them royalties. They are claiming. In fact, I think they're taking a few of the porn sites to court right now because those are the guys that have the money, and it's always about the money. So they're taking them to court trying to get money for their use of compression in the video.
There are actually a lot of people who are taking porn companies to task over a number of patents. And the interesting thing is that the porn companies are actually the worst ones in the world to try to do that to, because they've long fought off a lot of challenges to them on a civil and criminal basis.
So they understand how to handle courts.
So, yes, well, they've become very hard nuts
Yeah.
to crack after a while.
Well, my question really wasn't about the porn companies. It was about the certain patents up there
Sure.
that are really so broad that just everyone's going to own a royalty.
Well, there's always freak show kind of like patents that happen from time to time. That's because we live in a real world, and the real world has unfairness in it. And so really what your question is, how do we deal with unfairness? Where
Right.
somebody has gotten away with something they really shouldn't have gotten.
That is my real question.
Right. And unfortunately, that means that you have to bring justice back into a line here. And justice is a difficult thing. That's why we have lawyers and judges to begin with. There is also patent appeals processes. There is prior art. You can object to patents. I think really what it is that we need to have more scrutiny of a lot of these things. And one of the good things that some of the free software work was done was challenging really bogus patents.
Right.
And I think that that more contributions to people to do things like that are the best way of being able to eliminate those kinds of riffraff items.
So you're saying those should be challenged?
Absolutely.
But that is a cost of doing business.
Yeah, it's definitely the cost of doing business. And the problem is that now we're getting into an area of the business model for open development and free software. Okay?
Right.
Because it does not go for free because it costs you money. It costs a lot of money, a lot of effort for the skull sweat of people. It also costs a lot for people who use this software. They want to have a good engineered thing. Everybody wants to use something that runs smoothly. That's not going to be vanishing at any time soon. So we have another set of issues, and that is how do we establish good business models, even ones for people who don't necessarily want to be businessmen but want to contribute their software, their efforts in. I think, by the way, that a tax deduction for a lot of those developers is more than in line, because in the same way that we talk about the internet reducing the costs of the infrastructure because people are doing electronic transactions instead of driving places, I think that a lot of the infrastructure costs that are eliminated by free software should actually be realized. And nobody is arguing for that, and it's really kind of a silly thing.
How do they measure it?
Excuse me?
How do they measure it?
Well, you can monetize it in several ways. In particular, you can view where it has eliminated the cost of performing a similar operation by identifying where a download occurs and where the product is actually used. If the product goes into use in any way, shape, or form and has an average effectiveness as measured perhaps by somebody who does a review of the product, then you can monetize that quite nicely. It's a fairly simple model, but now I have to talk cost accounting. And what happens is you have this idea that everything has cost centers, and if you eliminate some of those cost centers, statistically on the average, that's a good enough measure to determine that it's actually reduced the overall cost of a grand infrastructure.
This is a Haas business school
That's
approach.
a business school answer. And if you want, I'll talk to you about it later, but it is something that's recognized already by the IRS. I think it's simply, nobody's bothered to bring it up. Yes?
I'll go with something completely different.
Sure.
If open software is to replace the commercial stuff, then it seems to me we'd have to have a lot more creativity. Most of what I see in open software tends to be copies of commercial software.
Absolutely.
Can you speak to that?
Oh, you're speaking my heart. That was one of the things that made me very sad. That made me go into business school because I began to realize that it wasn't the product, it was how the product was used. And that a lot of this revolved around, because I saw so many wonderful things that never got used. And I wanted to figure out why, because I didn't want to waste any time doing anything more that wasn't used strongly by people. And really what it is I ran into a gentleman at the Jurassic Software. Was it Doug? What's his last name? He was one of the panelists there.
No, Scott's into it.
Yeah,
I don't
he was the
know.
guy who did the game company. Was it Borland?
No, Trip Hawkins.
No.
Not Trip.
The other one. Anyways, this gentleman there who's responsible for, I'll get the name of the game company in just a second. They did actually the paint shop program, I think, before. Broderbund, thank you very much.
Okay.
Anyways, he made a point of saying that really what was lacking on the free software side was product management. Is that great developers didn't know that their product, the thing they were building, if it was done a little more like this, was 100 times more valuable to people and more interesting to people than a little like that. I got into trouble at Berkeley because I wanted to automate the error messages so that they would be a little bit more intelligible to people. It's because people were calling me on the phone saying, what's this weird message that the thing says every now and then? And the people would be, of course, English was their second language, and it would just completely fly over their heads. They wouldn't understand it at all. And what I was up against was, well, we always call it X. Why would you ever want to do anything? That's a stupid idea. Get it out of here. And I actually put the stuff in. It got taken out several times. And that was a bit annoying to me. But a lot of times, people develop for themselves when they need to be going, who is it I'm helping? Why is it I'm doing this in the first place? And when we tried to do that with 386 BSD, we came up with a intuitive installation process that would figure out and build itself as it was putting the software onto a machine. So it would find out the things that were missing and then would find them for you from various sources. And what it meant was that you had less time to mess around in setting up a system the first time.
You didn't have to know what your addresses were on your Ethernet card. It would determine it if it was IRQ 12 or IRQ 13. You didn't have you didn't have to know what your processor was necessarily. It was irrelevant. It would define all the devices. So I mean that was very critical because Dr. Dobbs users didn't know what was in their PC.
A lot of these people couldn't actually set it up. That got ripped out because people go, oh, I don't really like this. It's too Windows-ish. It's too DOS-ish. And the point is, it allowed the person to use BSD sooner and develop a liking for it. That's the kind of thing that I think is the big issue, is that you got to stop developing for yourself and develop for the people who care about it. It turns out that there's a lot of commercial software that isn't very well product managed to begin with. And it's a wonderful opportunity for open source development. There's a company called Punch Down South, which is doing something like this, and it's having very nice results. And I think that's going to be more common.
Kim Polizzi, when I saw her today, and she did Marimba, if you recall, which was probably the only real successful Java company, and it wasn't a tool company, commented that Thomas J. Watson said, when you declare success, innovation goes out the window. And one might think that by making an open source operating system, I did see a declaration of success. So why innovate at that point? Why take the risk? So if the founder of IBM saw this, this is a very well understood problem.
You were, yes, sir.
Yes. Can you comment on what is the most important for a sustainable open source business model?
The most important thing for open source sustainable business model, okay, is that you are solving a problem that isn't necessarily a problem that is simply one of displacement of an existing package. The most successful open source is right now games, where if you give the games away, it doesn't matter because maintaining the character is a service, and people want to have the characters in the game maintained. So you can have this stuff go out anywhere. You can have the CD-ROMs sitting around 7-Eleven or something like that, and it doesn't matter. So I think Doom's doing that, and a few other games that the source is available for, but it's the maintenance of the character turns out to be the service of it, and that's a very powerful thing, especially in Hong Kong and a couple of other areas where the role-playing games are really very intensive. That's really a fantastic area. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to get a comment on some stories in the news about SEO going after the Linux, all the Linux developers.
I hadn't heard that.
I've heard some Santa Cruz operations is saying that a lot of the Linux stuff is their stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And, so maybe it's just a little thing that went by.
Oh, it's a very significant thing, I think. What would you like to know?
No, I was just wondering if there was such a lawsuit.
There is.
Do you think that there'd be much that they could possibly gain from that? Or?
Well, you have IBM declaring itself for Linux and moving off all of its properties onto Linux and making a strong commitment to open source. I would say that I can understand both parties being very concerned about that, because one party could lose quite a bit, another party could lose quite a bit as well. I don't know about the specifics of each company's allegations, nor am I in a position to truly comment on any internal portions of that. But from a distance, it seems like it's one of those he said, she said battles that we will be able to understand better in 2020 hindsight what things were about. Now, some of it may actually we'll never know because it may be sealed in various forms by courts. But it would seem to me that a judge, if there is no basis in fact, should probably dismiss a suit fairly rapidly. If they're not dismissing it, that means that a judge is confused. Now, as you saw with the Microsoft case, how many judges did we go through along the way? How many different turns of of work. Are you all comfortable with the way that was settled? It's the same kind of thing. So it's an unfortunate thing that is confusing people about open development and free software. And I think that's the part I'm not happy with, is that it tars everyone with the same brush, even if they do the work. Now, there's a wonderful piece of software I really like a lot. It's called Zope. It's largely written in Python, done by the DigiCool, now Zope Corporation. And I would very much doubt that they have any kind of intellectual property situations of anybody on the planet due to the nature of how they put the thing together and its process. Because it is so openly documented, and you can see the change logs and see where everything came from. There's an example, apart from things I've been involved with, of somebody keeping to process. And I think that compare what they do against anybody else and make your own decision as to whether or not SCO's claims are valuable or not. If SCO has been stolen from, I don't think that that's necessarily what was intended by software developers. I don't think it was. I know I wouldn't do such a thing. I would want to know, however, if I was a developer, how I can make sure, like this gentleman said earlier, that I don't intrude on somebody's space. One of the things that's very unfortunate for most developers is in the art of creating intellectual property, nobody thinks about how to forwardly protect their software as they should by staking a claim. And the court system is unfortunate in having to go back and look at the train wreck and figure out from the train wreck where the justice lies. If you were the judge in those cases, you might find it difficult to figure fact from fantasy, from a bluffing attorney, or one that is truly genuine. I wouldn't want to be in that position. I'm not really wanting to sit in judgment of anybody. That's a difficult thing.
But as you said, the motivation is the money. If you are a media company.
Of course. Well, you know, motivations, you have to look for the long term. Now, look at stock prices. That seems to be a pretty good indication of motivation. What was SCO's stock price at the beginning of it? And what's it now?
$11, $12.
So they've gotten a pretty good rise out of that. You know, a lot of companies, they push things up a bit, and then there's some quick sales and
From 20 million. I heard they were around a little bit above 20 million. Last time I checked, they were at 273 million.
Market cap?
Yep.
Okay. Well, you know, that makes it more possible to get a company sold that way. That's something I've heard. I don't know if that's true.
I also heard the chief technology person sold all of their stock after the stock rose.
Yeah, but he did it too early. He sold last week when it was like 6 or 7 months.
But he still made out like 3 times.
You can't necessarily project from stock prices. There's a lot of jokes about Bill Joy selling his stock early, too.
I can guarantee you we don't have as much information as we had anyway, so that without even knowing him, I can do that.
Well, thank you very
Bill,
much.
thank you very
I'll
much.
speak with you later.
For the effort you put into it, I really appreciate that, and it's excellent. On 12 hours' notice. I noticed the charts are all dated, too. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any projects they want to announce? You want to announce?
Well, I have 2 things I'd like to talk about. I was debating whether to wear my Linux t-shirt or my Perl t-shirt. I, of course, decided on the Perl one. The Linux thing is, I work at Oracle during the day most of the time, and there's a lot of people there who are really into Linux, of course, because Oracle's really pushing Linux, and who don't want to make the drive all the way down to the Silicon Valley Linux Users Group in North San Jose, and don't want to drive all the way up to the city, and don't want to drive to Fremont. So there's been some discussion of forming a new Linux group on the peninsula. And if anybody here might be interested in attending, joining, participating in any capacity whatsoever, speaking in also as well.
Meeting in Belmont.
We're thinking of having, I'm trying to arrange to have meetings at Oracle. That's not finalized. Nothing is finalized at all. But we're moving forward with that plan shortly. So if anybody's interested in doing that, please see me. I have a place where you can write down your name.
And what day out of the month will you be picking?
We have not decided yet.
You will find that to be an interesting exercise.
We will. I have looked at some of the existing things, and I will try to pick something that is different enough that, for example, people who have a conflict on Wednesdays, it won't be on a Wednesday.
A strategy that almost everyone follows, and then 2 years later, everyone is on your day.
Personally, I'm leaning
Tuesday, Wednesdays,
for a
and
Thursday,
Thursdays are used up.
I'm leaning for a Thursday because there seem to be fewer events on Thursdays than on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And I'm leaning towards later in the month because there seem to be more events at the beginning of the month. But I'm open to any feedback on that. The other thing I'm here, which is the Pearl thing, is that the company that I own and operate in my copious spare time is Bayview Training, Bayview Consulting Services, and I teach Perl classes. So if anybody is interested in learning Perl, I have a one-day Perl seminar that gives you all the basics. I hold that on Saturdays. My next one is July 12th.
How much?
And I have discounts available for early registration and also a 20% discount for anybody in this group as well, as a thank you for allowing me to promote my thing. So please see me afterward. I also have a sign-up sheet for that. The standard price is $349. And I have discounts, $50 discount for early registration, 20% off for membership in this group. That brings it down a bit more, but it's still not cheap.
But you actually learn code, and you actually learn to do things.
We write code. We have, in lab projects, there's 10 different lab exercises during the course of the day. You have a Linux workstation in front of you that you write your code and do your work on. And by the end of the day, your head may be spinning, but you have a very solid knowledge of the language. That's the goal.
Very good.
Okay, and it's also a very small, intimate group. It's like, maybe 4 or 5 people. Okay?
Any other announcements anyway? Our next meeting in, I think it'll be the 15th of July, whatever the third Tuesday is that no one was on when I picked the third Tuesday.
Well, 12th is a Saturday, so.
Okay. We're going to have a gentleman, a vice president from the Giga Group come up. As we move forward, he's more and more convinced that everything becomes part of the internet. So he sees everyone working with everyone else, and if I'm working with you, you're on my disk drive, I'm on your disk drive, and we're all over in wide collaboration, and I don't want to go any farther than that because he'll take us through the details. And then we're hoping to have some people come in and talk about traffic shaping in August. That's still being finalized, and then we'll see what we can do about maybe going back to the business model after that. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.